Hello and welcome to NDARC's weekly webinar. My name is Thomas Santo Jr. and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Center at UNSW Sydney. Today I'm excited to be hosting this session by Dr. Simon Clay, the relationship between community connection and alcohol among LGBTQ+ individuals, freedoms and tensions. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the land from which I'm presenting today and which NDARC is located. I acknowledge the traditional owners of country across Australia and recognize that our speaker, panelists, and audience are joining from many different Aboriginal lands across Australia. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Simon, a postdoctoral research fellow at NDARC as well. Simon has a background in sociology, gender studies, and public health, and has been conducting research with people who use drugs and other marginalized groups over the past 10 years. Their work focuses on individuals with experiences with addiction treatment services, the social life of drugs, and community-based harm reduction practices, as well as the relationship between addiction, risk, and well-being. Simon is primarily a qualitative researcher who also works across methods to situate individuals' experiences within the broader legal, social, and political context. And today, they'll be presenting on how community connection shapes alcohol use among LGBTQ+ people and how engagement, belonging, and shifting social spaces influences decisions to drink, cut down, or abstain. I'm also excited that Associate Professor Dr. Daniel Demont will be joining us later on as a panelist. And Daniel is a associate professor from the University of Technology, Sydney, whose research focuses on sexual health, substance use, and harm reduction among LGBTQ+ communities. He's published widely across the intersections of drug use and sexual health, with a particular interest in understanding and reducing the harms associated with chemsex while respecting community agency and lived experience. Daniel is an advocate for evidence-based and stigma-free approaches to health promotion and regularly collaborates with community organizations and health services to translate his research into practice. So now I'd like to hand over the floor to Simon. Simon, you can turn on your camera and begin whenever you're ready, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. So today I am going to be talking about some research that looks at the relationship between community and alcohol use among people within the LGBTQ community. So I would first like to acknowledge the wonderful co-investigators, Wing, Emily, Amy, Scott, Karen, Louisa, Rachel, and Chris. And this project was generously funded by ACON. We ran this in 2023 to 2024, so we are still sharing the results as they come out. The full report is also available on the NDARC website. If you go to our resources page, you'll be able to find it there. So first of all, I think it's really fascinating looking at the relationship between community and substance use when it comes to members of the queer community. Looking at the literature on this, there's a really fascinating tension that comes out. There's a lot of work done that looks at how greater community connection, greater social cohesion, and a stronger sense of connection to others has reduced substance use, and people tend to report better health outcomes. And they found the inverse of that as well. Those who are feeling more socially isolated, those who have less social connections, tend to report higher rates of substance use and poorer health outcomes. So what if community connection was the catalyst for substance use? What if your ability to connect with others and the stronger that you felt, strong connection you felt with others was actually increasing your substance use? What happens then? So I think it's I think it's useful to have a quick look at how different people have spoken about substance use within queer communities, how it's been conceptualized, and a bit of the history, because I think a lot of the history actually informs what I'm going to present later on. So first and foremost, I think the history of gay and lesbian bars I think it's incredibly fascinating, but it really shows how there's a foundation of substance use within queer communities and how we relate to each other. It's kind of baked into the foundations. So the first instances we have of a reference to a gay bar or something that approximates a gay bar comes from the late 15th century in Florence. So since then, there have been lots of things written about queer people being in taverns or cabaret clubs or nightclubs or police breaking into public houses and things like that, like the molly houses of 18th century England. So it really shows how long this thing goes on for. In the 20th century, things started to really shift. And with the First and Second World War and the expansion of cities, a lot of people were moving into metropolitan centres. And there was also a lot of social and political change happening at the time. So until kind of relatively recently in the Western world anyway, being queer and being out in public was not necessarily safe. And so gay bars were one place where you could be visibly queer in a semi-public space. It was a place where you could feel safe. It was a place where you could connect with other people. It was where you could find job opportunities. It was also a site where political activism could take shape. It was where a lot of social movements took hold from as well. Think of the Stonewall riots. Moving on slightly, we have psychological models that are used to explain why substance use is higher within LGBTQ plus communities compared to the general population. And two of the big things that you often see is minority stress and AOD use as a maladjusted coping mechanism. So minority stress is the labor that people who are marginalized in society have to undergo in order to exist, essentially. So the added stress of feeling discriminated in the street, the added stress of having to deal with not being seen, the added stress of everything that comes with living on the margins. And so AOD use becomes a maladapted way of coping with that stress. The issue with this, I would contend anyway, is that it becomes very individualizing. You are the one that has the problem, not society that's making you feel this way. It puts the onus of responsibility onto the person to recover, rather than saying, well, it actually came from a systemic place. And it also says, well, this is bad and this is good. This is what bad health looks like. These are bad things that you shouldn't do. And this is how you should be. This is what good health looks like. The third approach is a lot more recent, and it comes out of the critical drug studies field. And it looks at how drug use can be something generative, something that queer people use to open up new ways of being, new ways of looking at themselves, understanding themselves. There's a lot of fascinating work in the chemsex field around how sexualized drug use can be a way of connecting with people in kind of unusual or strange or queer ways. So for our study, we recruited 30 participants who were based in New South Wales. The majority of them identified as a cis man. Most of them were between the ages of 30 to 39. And the majority of them were born in Australia. The interviews went for about 45 minutes to 60 minutes, yeah, transcribed verbatim. So I'd like to first start by looking at the general experience people said when they were talking about alcohol and social connection. And one of the big things that came up was drinking with other people helped to create a really strong connection. It helped create what we call queer kinships. And it really, people spoke about how it enriched their time with each other, and it gave them an excuse to see friends, to get together with other people. And because this was often taking place in gay bars or at queer events, there was a sense of safety as well, that you were away from what they called the straights, who were often portrayed as being quite aggressive and annoying and belligerent and just unpleasant to be around. So being in gay bars and drinking with friends and being out around other queer people allowed them to feel themselves, a sense of authenticity, and feel a sense of peace as well. It also highlights how gay bars can be forms of community centres as well, because people were talking about, this is where I go to be with my friends, this is where I go to see drag shows, this is where I go to feel connected to my people, essentially. So it really did solidify those community connections. It also gave people a reason to pull in other people from outside. So we had a couple of people who lived out in more rural and regional areas, and they spoke about how they would put on big events for people who did live far out, who didn't live near city centres. So they could feel a sense of connection with other queer people, and they could know who was queer in their general area. There was also, this was really complicated as well. There were some really difficult aspects to this as well. So almost everyone spoke about how drinking was an expectation at social events. It was compulsory almost. And if you didn't drink, then there were a variety of repercussions, but there were generally some kind of social sanction. You were made to feel a bit uncomfortable. You had to give some kind of explanation that was deemed reasonable enough. Otherwise, you would be framed as a bit of a party pooper or someone who was bringing the vibe down. So people often felt a little torn about what to do because they didn't want to feel guilty of spoiling the party. They didn't want to feel like they were being excluded or want other people to feel like they were being excluded. But if alcohol was starting to affect them adversely, they were starting to notice that, you know what, I'm not actually enjoying drinking that much anymore. I'm not actually getting a lot of pleasure from getting drunk with friends on the weekend. They said at some point you end up losing some friends. At some point, people stop inviting you to things. At a certain point, you end up losing some of your social life. And so they said, I had to kind of figure out how much of my social life I'm willing to give up and how much drinking I'm willing to put up with. And so it was kind of this cost-benefit analysis, this edge work between friendships and connections and personal health. And generally where people ended up at was, I'm going to reduce my drinking a certain amount, and often that means that the friends that I drink a lot with or my friends who are heavier drinkers, I'm not going to see them as often. And I guess that's the price that I'm just going to have to pay. For some people, going sober was a really wonderful experience, but it also meant that they would lose some friends. But they also spoke about how it kind of opened up sober social worlds, that they would make these new friendship groups that weren't based around alcohol, that they would find new activities to do and meet people that they would go running with instead of just going drinking with. Because people often spoke about how it felt quite boring after a while, that was the only thing you would do. If you got together, then you would just go drinking with friends. And they said, I needed more. I need more in life. Sometimes alcohol was great for people who were feeling quite anxious around social situations. It helped to ease that anxiety and allow them to engage more socially. But this was a double-edged sword. So Oscar, one of the participants, spoke about how he performed anxiety at social events by drinking heavily as an attempt to initiate conversations of care with his friends. He says, if I'm drinking at a social occasion, I'm also performing anxiety to people that know me to show that I'm actually struggling at this point, which is not really a message that anyone gets. But it's something that I'm consciously doing. It's a way of saying, this is actually a little hard for me right now. Thus, I'm going to pour another beer or something. But no one gets that message. Normally, I just drink those things just to have something to do with my hands. Otherwise, I don't know what to do with them, which is kind of sad. I'll finish one, then I'll grab another drink or a glass of water to break it up every so often. Otherwise, I'm just kind of existing in space, which I don't enjoy very much. What I really like about Oscar's quote here is that he really exemplifies that tension of wanting to be there, but wanting to feel soothed by something, that there's this tension that needs to be broken by something, and that tension kind of changes its form depending on the context. Care was a really, really big topic as well, and participants spoke about informal types of care and formal types of care. In terms of informal forms of care, there were lots of forms of harm reduction techniques that people spoke about, and there was almost an act of generosity or love that came with them. People spoke about how they would ensure that friends didn't become too intoxicated, or they would count drinks of themselves or with friends. They would tell friends ahead of time that, oh, I only want to have so many drinks, so stop me if I go to have another one. If they would bring like a sober friend with them, and so they could be a wingman to each other, or interspersing alcoholic drinks with non-alcoholic ones. Daniel spoke about how caring for others in this way was an act of love. So he said, I sort of regulate myself, like on the more personal level. I sort of try to notice it in other people when they try to drink in excess, and I do try to check in with them, like, hey, are you still all right? It's good to have fun, but then you also want to do it in a sustainable and reasonable way. If I'm having a party, what's important to me is the welfare of the people around me. I don't want people to get to the point where they're stumbling about or hanging hangovers the next day. I try to make sure that they're well hydrated and things like that. He would talk about how he would host parties and run around with hors d'oeuvres and pieces of food so that people would feel full and happy and would drink but not get too drunk. But there are also limits on how much care and how much support a person could offer others. There were a few participants who had friends who were managing or who had been managing quite severe problematic relationships to drugs and alcohol. And being the only person for that other person became quite a burden after a while. And often led to a type of exhaustion or burnout, and them saying, I can't do this anymore. You know, I want to be that person for you, but it's becoming too much. And then that would start to impact their relationship to the queer community because it was all wrapped in with each other. But they said, if you have a whole team of people, if you have a whole group of friends supporting one person who's going through something, that's what makes it work. That's what makes it manageable. That's what makes it happy for everyone. In terms of formal care, people had a lot of thoughts about this. So one of the things that really came through was that the level of problematic drinking within the queer community is exacerbated by the barriers to formal care, in addition to the normativity of heavier forms of drinking within the community. So people were talking about how there's a higher threshold that people in the queer community have to hit before they think, actually, this is a problem. And So once you hit that stage, then once you start trying to seek out help, then you come up to these other barriers, such as a complete lack of services that are available, or when you do find a service, them saying, actually, there's a long wait time. I don't know if we'll be able to get you in right now when you need it. Or there being a lack of people who specialize in queer health at that center who are available at that time. Shame was another reason why LGBTQ people often struggle to come out. A lot of people spoke about how alcohol and shame and guilt are tied together quite tightly, and that because alcohol is such a charged topic, it is so burdened with morals, and people have a lot of thoughts and opinions about it, that it's really hard to be neutral about it. But what I found really interesting was that there was almost this parallel between the shame of being queer and the shame of problematic drinking. And that being shameful of your queer identity kind of got wrapped up in the shame of real problematic drinking. And this will make a little bit more sense later on when I get to the relationship between queer identity and alcohol. But participant Daniel elaborates on this shame and guilt of alcohol use, and he says, problematic alcohol use has a lot of shame and a lot of guilt attached to it. Most people know that it's not really right to take it to a point of excess, but how do we let people know that it's okay to talk about it and not feel that shame and guilt? I think that's a tough barrier to mitigate, and culturally, we still aren't there yet. The guilt and the shame associated with alcohol makes it a lot harder to be vulnerable because there's always that fear of judgment. It'd be great if the wider collective was already accepting and you knew that they're not going to say, oh, you're a disgrace to society, you're a disgrace to your family, or things like that. But rather they would say, hey, that's all right. Dad and I used to do that a long time ago, and we're still here. We have some strategies. Don't worry, we'll get you there. You'll be fine. So segueing into the relationship between alcohol and queer identity, I found this intensely fascinating because there's a lot of layers to this. So one of the really big things that came through was that substance use is a quintessential part of the queer community and the way that people embodied or performed queer identity. And we can kind of understand why if we look at the history of gay bars and the fact that queerness and being out and openly queer has historically been confined to gay bars where alcohol has been served. And so these two things have been constantly next to each other for a very, very long time. Alcohol is at all queer events. It's at all sites that are marketed as queer, like gay bars. So it becomes really ingrained in the culture. And it also becomes tied quite closely to pride. At Mardi Gras, alcohol sponsorship is everywhere. And so being proud of one's identity and alcohol or drinking or taking drugs or partying kind of get tied together really, really tightly. So some participants said it even feels like if there was a dry event, people wouldn't really think it's real. They would be always wanting to know, where's the alcohol? What is this? Is this a kid's party? Why am I here? There was also some concerns that young people, when they're coming out, that because it is such a formative time, that AOD use gets kind of sewn into their identity development at that stage. So Philip, he said, if you're struggling with being accepted or you're struggling with isolation and wanting to be accepted by the community, at the moment, the community and what they represent, it almost seems like it revolves around drinking. So I think from a young age, people in the community are presented with, this is the LGBT community, we hang out on Oxford Street. This is a street full of bars and we go out drinking. I think it's easy to get caught up in that, especially if you're coming out and you're just 18 or fairly young. You'll meet your group of friends and start following that path of going out every weekend and drinking. I think this quote really exemplifies how it is really easy for it to get ingrained and for that to become a pattern. And if your coming out experience happens in bars, happens at parties, happens through parties, and you do feel a sense of pride about that because that's how you've connected with your other people, your friends, your community, you can see how if you do start to develop a problematic relationship with AOD use, how that can be quite complicated to unpick and to manage. The other aspect was that the politics of queerness and the politics of AOD use had a really fascinating relationship. So substance use is political. It's inherently political. There's a lot of politics around it. And queerness, for a lot of participants, they defined it as being the opposition to the norm. So whatever was considered normal or normative or what like straight people do, then queerness is the opposite of that. So sobriety was seen as the norm, therefore alcohol and drug use is queer. That's what queer people do. Queer partying is a form of rebellion, it's a form of liberation, it is a form of breaking out, and it's a form of celebration. And again, we kind of come back to the tying together of gay bars and pride and protest and coming out, all coming together. The problem with this, which one participant put quite eloquently, is that it becomes really reactionary. So anytime someone says, hey, I think that your relationship to alcohol is kind of problematic, you can say, well, you're just straight, you don't get it. This is our culture, this is what we do. Queer people party, we like to have fun. But this participant said, this ultimately becomes self-defeating and ultimately becomes quite problematic because even when there's public health messaging that's saying consuming alcohol in this amount is not good for you, queer people saying, well, you can't tell me what to do. This is just the state trying to intervene on my lives. This is just heteronormative culture trying to ruin what we have, trying to dilute queer culture. So the consequence of all of this is that people felt like rejecting AOD use, becoming sober, wanting to cut down, ultimately meant that they were rejecting part of their queer identity or rejecting their community or rejecting their pride in some way. And that's obviously really, really difficult. And you can see why a lot of people really struggle with this as well from this. There are also some more structural issues at play. And so there was a lot of discussion from participants around the way that alcohol companies sponsored queer events and the way that corporate sponsorship floated Mardi Gras and Pride. And people felt kind of complicated about this, but mostly they were very scathing. And they said, we think it's terrible that the main money that supports this is from alcohol companies because they don't actually care about us. They're just wanting to make a quick dime. And it's a really easy way to do it because you put some rainbow posters up of your liquor bottle and people will buy it. And so it was seen as like this empty gesture towards social inclusion that was quite hollow. And people were quite cynical about this as well. There was also quite a strong critique that it kind of made drinking seem innocuous or harmless because alcohol was presented as very fun and light, and this is pride, and we party with friends and we have a good time. There's no bad side to alcohol, there's no dark side. But people also said, I acknowledge that without this money, a lot of these events wouldn't be able to happen. So in that way, it's kind of like a necessary evil. And so there was this discomfort that people felt. Pinkwashing and alcohol was another thing that came up quite a bit. And a lot of people were quite cynical about it, but there was one person who spoke about how rainbow packaging still means something to older queer people. He said, I think that brands have been very skillful at targeting how they've appealed to queer communities. I think for a lot of the community, you form a brand allegiance with brands that have actively reached out to the community. I would like to think that I'm a fairly intelligent person, but I'll be at a bottle shop or a food and wine fair or something, and there will be something that has a particular product messaging or coloring or advertising, and I'll buy it. I think it is very effective that acceptance / being seen by brands overrides any thought around any physical or financial impact of that brand or that product. Now, what Richard's highlighting kind of goes back to when queer advertising kind of started in the late 80s and early 90s, where companies like Absolute were marketing directly to the gay community during the AIDS and HIV epidemic and saying, we're standing with you. And so it actually did mean something back then. It was really important. It was a huge social statement, but that has changed quite a lot over the past 30 odd years. And what it means now to people is quite different. One of the other big things that came out was the cost of living crisis and gentrification. People said, I just cannot afford to go out anymore. And a lot of bars are closing down because they can't pay the rent for these exorbitant prices that are happening in inner city suburbs. So people are just staying at home and drinking alone instead. And a couple of participants said, I know some friends who are actually drinking a lot more now that they're doing it at home instead of being out and being with their community. So some concluding thoughts. Members of the LGBTQ plus community have a really complicated relationship to alcohol and drug use. Partly because of its ubiquity in society. It's absolutely everywhere. The way that it's tied to the embodiment of queer identity, the way that's performed, the social expectations we have around being in different spaces, the norm of having alcohol at every social gathering or the expectation to drink, and the various barriers that prevent people from seeking out help or the barriers that prevent them from getting help that's a lot more productive or generative. But in saying that, alcohol offers a lot of things as well. It helps bring people together. It creates fun memories. It's really enjoyable. When it's fun, it's really fun. Bars are vital community centers. It helps people to understand themselves, to move along through their personal journey. And it becomes a vehicle for people to express care for one another as well. So I might wrap it up there and we can do some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Simon, for a really thoughtful and compelling presentation. I always enjoy your slides, as well as the thought that you put into the way that you have with words and putting in the participants' responses into a way that I can understand it within the context of the community. And I think, yeah, thank you so much. Daniel, if I see you've turned your camera on, and everyone, just so you know, there's a Q&A button at the bottom where you can submit your questions. And Daniel, I wonder if I could just ask your opening thoughts or anything that stuck out to you from Simon's presentation.
Well, I think it's actually super consistent. I did my PhD on substance use and how it is affected by community connectedness and community participation. And what I actually saw in that work, but also ever since then, it is really like the struggle people have between a community that is open-minded and maybe so open-minded that it at some points can actually lead to this issue. As you sort of like said, it's sort of like nobody has to tell us anything. And that does not necessarily always be a very positive thing for that matters. And one of those aspects that was actually really present in my studies as well was like bars, like the gay bar. And the gay bar that remains and continues to remain really central to our communities and the infrastructure within our communities, where alcohol and other drugs automatically become tied to belonging to the community itself. So I think that is from that perspective. But I think what we really need to avoid, and that is what we have quite a lot in research that is in substance use in LGBTIQA+ communities, including myself, I'm including myself very specifically in that, is that we always fall into these simplistic binaries that we really need to resist much, much more, because that is how we can get towards people. So this unhealthy versus healthy, risky versus safe, protective versus harmful, and all of those aspects. But when we try to understand, and I think maybe some of you are familiar with Kane Race's work about disinhibition around queer communities and substance use, but to understand that substance use in our communities is or embodies at the same time both risk and resilience, both exclusion and belonging, and how we can make sure that we have those more tied together in terms of helping people who actually don't want to consume or who can't consume anymore, who are on a pathway of recovery, but also have the space for those people who want to experience this inhibition.
Mm. Mm. Totally agree. Thank you, Daniel. Wondering, Simon, before we get into the group questions, the participants who began to cut down on their alcohol intake and abstinent, I was wondering if they elaborated more on what their relationship to the queer community looked like. If there was any more participant thoughts on that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. The general vibe was that they felt a little less connected to the community, but they were a lot happier. Or that they had lost some friends, but the friendships that they did maintain, they felt were really, really solid, and that they got a lot out of them. So it really differed between people, though. It was quite a heterogeneous thing, but generally people, or maybe they just mentioned it less. And so it wasn't necessarily that they felt less of a connection, but it seemed to be less of a priority or less at the forefront when they started cutting down or went sober or yeah.
Could you just clarify when you say it seemed to be when you say it, could you just clarify for me what you mean? That you mean their connection to the queer community, or?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Like
Mm.
in your work, have you had people who have like gone sober, cut down, and yeah.
Well, I mostly talk to young people as part of my work, and particularly as part of my PhD, which means these long histories of excessive substance use simply are just not yet established within that population. But in the studies I have recently undertaken, you can see that it's sort of like the struggle for a lot of people who say, oh, I have to cut down on my drinking, or I have to cut down on substances I use. And for them, it's automatically also means to actually have less of a participation, not necessarily connection, but participation in the community. Because for them, that is a level of struggle that is introduced to like everyday living, is that the community is a place where it is much more difficult for me to resist this because of like the center stage it actually plays in. I still remember one participant in one of my studies who said, substance use is like an initiation ritual in a lot of LGBTIQA+ communities. It is something you have to be part of it. As you said, so I think you mentioned like the word party pooper at some point. I think it goes very close into this sort of like same direction. And a lot of people who wanted to have alternatives, which you have if you're like an adolescent, at least in the big urban cities, when you have like 2010 here in Sydney, and you have similar things in Brisbane, Adelaide, not necessarily outside of that. And I think it's like this time just after that, where you are immediately cut off of those things, are expected to build your own adult network without that help and assistance with that. And there is just not that many things you can do outside of toxic online groups, bars, clubs, and Grindr.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, that was something that a lot of participants said was, I wish there was sober events. I wish there was some kind of alternative that was dedicated to the queer community, because it kind of felt like non-queer events was everything else. And if they wanted to do something that wasn't around drinking, but was queer, there just wasn't a lot on offer.
Yeah. Wondering if we get to one of the first listener questions. Higher threshold as a barrier to engaging with formal care by the queer community. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So participants spoke about how compared to people outside of the community, that within the queer community, they noticed that people had to be drinking a lot more before it was recognized as being an issue, compared to people outside the community. And so, yeah, what would be considered a problem outside of the community, we tend to see as kind of fine. And so as a result, people are waiting longer until they seek out help. And there was also the implication that the problem is worse now compared to if you were outside of the community, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Nothing in this sentence. It's also what often comes and what a lot of people, particularly outside of the community, forget is that a lot of the low threshold services that exists in alcohol and drug use are often associated with religious organizations. And to be clear, they have not necessarily been our best friends over the last 2,500 years.
It's a very good point. Yeah. Wondering if we get to another question as well. So Carmen, or CJ, who's a social worker, I believe Amsterdam has a better idea. When they were there last year, they had LGBTIQA safe cafes, still building community and still social, but away from drugs and alcohol. I wonder if there's any thoughts on that. I guess so. Safe cafes was one idea. Were there any other ideas or things that you've seen implemented, maybe even outside of what the responses were from participants or from other areas, Daniel or Simon, that have promoted connection, I guess, with the queer community while also not without substances? Yeah.
Miriam Margulies' show, it's on ABC iView. It's wonderful, but she's in Edinburgh, I think. And yeah, she goes to a queer cafe, and the whole thing is about, let's make a drug-free space. Let's make a sober space for queer people. Participants mentioned a couple of things, but I'm sure they're out there. I don't know them. I haven't seen a lot of them. Yeah, Daniel, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I know there's a lot of informal things, again, particularly in the urban areas, informal things, meet and greet groups, many of them who are not centered around alcohol, but still taking place in places where that is centered around. But we do not have the infrastructure, both community-wise as well as funding-wise, as is available in many European countries. I've been recently with a couple of people to Cologne Pride, and as part of that, they actually had a couple of events that were specifically designated drug and alcohol-free. That was sort of like an alternative to actually being able to participate in the Pride and the festivities around that, and in a range of activities, not just sitting around and talking to each other, without the actual consistent presence and the associated pressure of substance use.
Another question from an anonymous attendee, in regards to the number of trans and gender diverse people in the study, Simon, and whether or not you collected any information on the connection and relationship with substances among this population.
We did have a few trans participants. I can't recall the number, but from memory, they kind of had a similar story, similar narratives, where AOD use was a lot more pronounced in their earlier stages during the coming out compared to other participants. But yeah, in other ways, their experiences were pretty much in line with everyone else's. I just remember they had a few more stories about being acute mental unhappiness and having more acute problems with AOD use. But yeah, a lot of it had been resolved by the time we got together. Yeah, I don't know, that's not a great answer, I'm sorry.
The literature outside of your study, is there anything on that? Or Daniel, do you have any thoughts there in regards of other studies that may have looked at this, or an area for future research?
Regarding trans people and AOD use?
Yeah, and I guess that and their connection with the queer community, and whether or not, I guess, it differs, or if there's different experiences.
I have a grant application aimed at this very topic.
That's fantastic to hear.
Yeah, so there's kind of like a lot of stuff around it that looks at sections of that, but there isn't anything that looks specifically at that triad of work. Daniel, do you have any thoughts on like that field, trans people connection, AOD use?
I don't want to make things up on the spot. So even though I'm really good at making things up on the spot, I don't want to. Most of my research is in gay and bisexual men. It has been rather recently that I'm trying to be significantly more inclusive, because I think that these barriers we make between the individual letters of the quilt bag actually are not particularly helpful. We see higher levels in trans men and trans women when we have a look at all of the available data. How that relates back to community, I think that is a thing where we need much more work to be done, particularly given when we have a look at what's happening in the last couple of years with like an increased levels of transphobia, including within queer communities. So that might even have impacted that as well. So I think we need much more work on that. And the inclusion we have in studies where you have 2, 3, 4 trans people in there, I think it's just not enough at the moment, at least from my body of work, to say anything meaningful about that.
For the next question, impact of cost of living crisis and people turning to drinking at home alone. I thought that was a really interesting comment from one of the participants as well. Do you think that the increase of cost of going out will impact the social connection within the QIA plus community, and whether or not, I guess you could have two things that may happen in relation to that. Maybe more, it could provide an opportunity for events or groups that don't necessarily have to spend as much money in regards to alcohol when they're getting together, or it could also drive to more isolated drinking. Or I don't know if any thoughts there, Daniel or Simon.
No idea.
We don't know. This is another area for future research. Yeah.
I found it really fascinating because I think it's indicative of the social climate at the moment. And it kind of put everything into a larger context, which I really enjoyed. Because people were saying that this is not just the queer community here. I am struggling with everyone else here because it is so expensive to live in this city. It is so expensive to buy food. It is so expensive to pay rent. And as a result, this is impacting on the way that I can connect with my community. But people were finding ways around this as well. Like they were making their own nights, their own parties, their own underground clubs and things like that.
Mm.
So there were ways around it that people were finding, but there was a sense of people starting to feel a bit disenfranchised and feeling a bit defeated. And one participant almost framed it as like this nihilism of everything's fucked, the government screwed us over, the cost of living is through the roof, I can't afford everything, let's just get wasted because there's nothing else to do.
Fair.
So yeah, it's really complicated, and the fact that bars have been closing down and there has been so much anxiety around that, I think shows that they still do have an incredible relevance, even though people have said, oh, well, you know, Grindr's the new gay bar, you know, it's superfluous. I don't think it is. I think they serve a really, really important purpose. I think just the symbolism of having like a physical place to go is really, really important. I think what that represents for people is incredibly important, and having that taken away is causing a profound sense of loss within the community. Yeah.
It's bittersweet. That's what one of participant once said when we talked about like the closing of gay bars or queer venues. They called it bittersweet because sweet from the perspective is that many young people don't need it anymore because they can hang out and have social connections in other places with a lower level of fear of stigma and discrimination. But also bitter because at the same time it actually is, because there is a gay bar is more than just a place to drink. It is related to memories, to community building, to the events and the things that are happening, to the pictures you see online that are 30, 40, 50 years old, that have a meaning beyond just the alcohol that is associated with it. Plus, there's still a safe space and really important for people that at the intersection of marginalizations of different ones, people who may be more visibly queer, or people who are just older, who actually do not have the same luxury as growing up in a more open-minded world.
I think we'll end with first. Lucy posted Somewhere Sober event in regards to a recent event in Melbourne, and I think for the last question we'll look at moving forward. So did participants talk about potential ways of moving forward or disentangling queer identity from alcohol use, or any ideas or other literature that related to that? Daniel? Simon? Well, first round participants first from Simon, and then
that's, I guess, related to your study. So
yeah.
In terms of moving forward, I guess if I had to like sum everything up into a couple of sentences, it would be people saying, I just would like more options. And I would like the ability to not feel judged if I decide to drink or not drink. And I just want to be with my people. And I want to feel safe and I want to feel healthy with them. And so what that looked like changed between people, but yeah, just I think having less pressure on alcohol consumption and having that as a reflection on you as a person and your morals, trying to like untangle that a little bit so that people have a little bit more freedom, I guess. Daniel?
I think it's like four things. One of them is obviously to recognize the importance of community, both the importance of community and resilience, but also at the same time that something that can be so strong, so important, so resilience building is also the one that can lead to riskier behaviors at the same time. To understand that we do need those alternatives and that it is not just the responsibility of the state, because sometimes we are really good at waiting for the state to give us money so we can do something. I don't think we always have to wait until we get money, but I think we need to also provide those spaces ourselves. We have done that for a very, very long time. So we need to also get rid of that connection and dependence we have on public funding from that perspective. And also to actually just accept the ambivalence as well, to accept that drug use needs to be understood as a health challenge, but also as a cultural practice at the same time, and how we can combine those two.
Well, some great final thoughts, and thank you, Daniel, for joining us, and Simon for a really great presentation. And I'll ask everyone to look for the next webinar and sign up for that. And again, thank you all for joining us, and appreciate your attendance. And I know we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I'm sure Simon would be happy to be reached out in regards to any questions that we didn't get to answer. But thank you again, everyone.